Okay, welcome back to Unit 7. And for Unit 7, the art medium that we're going to be talking about is printmaking. And printmaking is a pretty interesting topic, and it's a definitely complex topic. There's a lot of stuff to learn about and a lot of stuff that could be possibly put on a test because it is a very technical medium. And this is the second time that we've really been introduced to the idea of indirect art processes, right? If you remember, we talked about casting earlier in the semester when we were talking about sculpture, and casting is a form of indirect sculpture. And what I mean by that is where the artist puts a lot of work into making a thing that isn't the actual work of art, and from that thing they make a system that then transfers that to another thing that actually makes the thing. Right? In this case, so that an artist works on the model, and then from the model they make the molds, and then the whole system of molds, and with all of that, they then pour the molten bronze, and that makes the thing, it makes the actual sculpture. Well, the same is true with printmaking. In printmaking, the artist puts a lot of their hand into a surface that isn't the work of art, but that is the surface that then it gets inked in some way and then run through a press with a piece of paper, and then the thing that's printed out on the piece of paper is the work of art. And that's the basic definition of printmaking, right? Which is that you make a thing, you ink a thing, you run it through a press, or you apply some sort of pressure so the ink is transferred onto a piece of paper. Um, and one of the things about printmaking, like bronze casting and the other indirect form of art that we've learned about, it does have the possibility of making multiples, and that becomes a very important part of printmaking later on. So to start with, we're talking about printmaking now because it is an extremely important part of the Baroque art and of the late Baroque especially. But it actually was also a really important part of the earlier world, of the transition from the late Gothic into the Renaissance. And probably the most important event was the invention of, the printing press. Because with the invention of the printing press, with printing books, then printing images to go with the books becomes a very important part of art. And so to start with, this lecture is going to be about a number of different types of printmaking, and we're going to kind of group them into three main groups, right? We're going to talk about each of those main groups. So the first group is relief, and that includes like woodcut and Japanese woodblock printmaking. We're going to talk about intaglio, that includes etching and dry point and engraving. We'll be talking about planographic and stencil-based printmaking. Um, and as we get to each one, I'll kind of explain how they work. But the main thing to remember here is that for each one, they hold the ink differently, right? And so these three, relief, intaglio, and planographic, they all have this basic idea that there's a thing, a plate, essentially, or some sort of matrix that is then inked, but the ink is held onto that surface in a different way. The distinction between what is inked and what is not is made in a different way. Stencil is actually completely different in that the ink goes through a surface, right, rather than is held onto a surface and pressed into a piece of paper. So we're going to start with talking about relief printmaking. And so relief printmaking is where the artist, I'll go back to the previous page in a second, but I think this image maybe in some ways communicates what relief printmaking is a little bit better. Relief printmaking is where the artist has a block, like let's say a block of wood, right? And then they carve into it. And everywhere that they carve, right, they're carving down, those are areas that will not receive ink. So in order to make light areas, they have to carve away and cut away. And everywhere that they leave raised up to the top surface, that will receive ink when they roll ink over the whole thing. And then, so they carve away all the lights, leaving all the darks. Then they ink it with a dark, with a roller. They ink it with a black ink, and then they lay it over a piece of paper, and they apply a lot of pressure. They might roll it through a press, or in some types of relief printmaking, you might just press it into the piece of paper and then burnish it using like some sort of, one common thing is a wooden spoon. Let's go back for a second. So here we have a lot of different kinds of examples of relief printmaking. And some of these probably look surprising to you because we have these really soft gradations. So these may not look like what a relief print might be, what you imagine, right? We don't have that kind of grainy mark making. And these are known as Japanese woodblock prints. And they're made where there were usually like uh, somewhere between 20 to 40, I think 40 is probably the max amount, of different blocks that were used to make a print like this. And each block would have been inked with a different set of colors. Um, and so that they just layer all these little different details to make an image like this. It's a very complex system of relief printmaking, but very, very effective, creates very beautiful images. Um, so relief. Next thing we're going to be talking about is engraving. Let's go back to that first page, right? So relief printmaking, now we're talking about different forms of intaglio. Now intaglio, all forms of intaglio have the same basic principle that you start with some kind of, usually a metal plate, could be another material, but usually a metal plate, and then you scratch into it, and that the lines that you cut into the metal plate are the things that hold the ink. So fundamentally, intaglio is really the opposite of relief. In relief, what you carve away doesn't hold the ink, and the things that you leave raised get the ink. In intaglio, it's the opposite. You carve lines into the plate, then you ink it, then you wipe it, and everything that wasn't scratched will be clean and not have any ink, but everything that was scratched is going to hold on to that ink. Okay, so let's go back. We'll talk about some engraving. So engraving is one of the simpler forms of intaglio printmaking, where the artist himself actually physically engraves the lines. It requires a lot of strength and a lot of precision, and only someone with the chops of an Albrecht Durer really could pull it off so well. But here we have two examples of engravings by him. Whereas etching is a different medium, because in engraving you have to do those cut lines by hand. In etching, you use an acid to do the work for you. The way that works is you have a plate, a metal plate, and you cover it with kind of a rubbery sort of material called a ground, right? But the ground is easily scratchable. So it's like this black tarry kind of substance, kind of rubbery sort of substance. The whole plate is covered in it. Then you transfer your drawing onto that tar, and then you start scratching away lines. And everywhere that you make a line, that's going to be a place where when you later put this plate into an ink bath or into a acid bath, that it's going to start to etch into those lines, right? Everywhere that the ground is intact, the acid will not touch the metal at all. So it's covered in this rubbery sort of material. You scratch away lines and you build up the drawing, and then you put it in an acid bath, and then the acid does the work for you of cutting those lines deep into the plate. And so one of the things you can do with etching is you can get really, really rich values, because you can build up lots of lines that, and lots of kind of cross contour lines, or lots of hatching and cross hatching lines, and build up darker and darker values. Um, and like I said in the last lecture, one of the things about Rembrandt was that he was known for this very kind of loose way of inking, where he would um, over ink some areas and under ink others for a very kind of atmospheric and very painterly sort of effect. So like these areas are very lightly inked. Oh, that is my 1 minute warning. So here's some more examples of Rembrandt and some of his etchings. And another thing about an etching is that because you could sand the plate, um, that the artist actually has a chance to kind of like make, build up the composition, then test print it, see if they like it, and then change it and move it around. So you can actually see he started with this plate here, but didn't like all these figures here, then removed, and then start to build up in a new direction and change the artwork that way. All right, next we'll be talking about Mezzotint.